Along with extra time and lower instances of unpredictable weather, there are a variety of benefits that come with fall ESN application. Learn more at smartnitrogen.com.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio.
Welcome to this Tuesday edition of RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. It is Tuesday, October 8th, and that means I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, for Tuesdays with Lyndsey. And today's show is a bit of a special one. So a little sneak peek, if you haven't figured out on social media yet, twice a year, the Real Agriculture team gets together en masse, and we actually sit down, we spend 2 days doing some strategic planning, we do some learning, we do some professional development. And the one in the fall, which is happening right now, we call it sort of our mini summit. So this is our content team that's all getting together. And so because of that, we don't have a ton of time actually to get everything else done in a day. So for today's show, we've actually taken an entire episode of the Agronomists. And I've cut it down so that it'll actually fit in this time slot. But we are going to explore soil pH. How does pH impact nutrient availability and uptake? Yes, there's such thing as too high, but most farmers are going to be dealing with too low of a pH, so an acidic soil, or areas of their soil that have become acidic over time. And so we've got three absolute powerhouses to discuss this. So on the show today, you are going to hear from Doctors Alan Blaylock, he's with Nutrien, Miles Dyck with the University of Alberta, and Jeff Schoenau with the University of Saskatchewan. We've got a very wide breadth of knowledge, and it goes down several feet deep. See what I did there? All right. So without further ado, let's get to today's show. So this is from the episode of The Agronomists. It was, of course, recorded live, 8 p.m. Eastern on Monday night. That's an important thing because you too can actually participate in upcoming episodes. So be sure to check us out, 8 p.m. Eastern on Monday nights. Okay? All right. Let's hop to a break and I'll be back with this show, RealAg Radio, but a special soil pH edition. For agronomically effective dual UAN inhibition, the smart answer is Tribune Nitrogen Stabilizer from Koch Agronomic Services. To learn how its two active ingredients protect UAN from three forms of nitrogen loss, visit kochag.ca. That's KOCHAG.ca.
Your co-op grow team are your local experts because we live here too. Our agronomic specialists stay up to date with the latest research and technology to help support your entire farm operation. Talk to our team for advice tailored to your farm's needs. We have recommendations to help you optimize your crop yield and quality while enhancing the health of your land. Co-op, we're all growing together. Here for your farm, here for your family. Learn more at coop.crs/farm.
We're going to talk to Jack Legg, SGS's Business Development Manager. Let's talk about some of the testing that SGS Guelph does.
Yes, so at our facility, we're predominantly testing for nutrients. So soil testing for fertility to manage crop production. Same in the greenhouse world, but they're testing water and the soil that's growing media. And then the livestock side of things, we're testing the feeds and forages and feed ingredients to optimize nutrition and maximize, or at least try to optimize growth and production for the farmer. But SGS also has many different labs in the network, so we can help out from an environmental standpoint. Maybe it's heavy metals testing or contaminants. We've got seed testing capabilities.
Congratulations on the 40-year anniversary of the SGS Guelph Lab. Quite an accomplishment. And you can find out more about SGS to help you elevate your business by calling 1-800-952-5407.
Welcome back to Real Ag Radio here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. I am your host for the day, Lyndsey Smith, and you need to start prepping for next year's emergence with fall tillage solutions from Väderstad, including the Väderstad Carrier High-Speed Disc, the Top-Down Cultivator, Wheel-Rich Chisel Plows and Disc Rippers, and Heavy-Duty Wishek Discs. Equipment for all field conditions, soil types, and tillage practices. Find the right tool for your farm at Väderstad.com. We're going to hop now to the discussion of soil pH, already in progress, of course. This was recorded live, remember. We start with a fantastic joke from the audience from Dr. Dave Hooker. Dr. Dave Hooker wins already for Best Dad Joke of the Night. This episode seems quite basic, but he will remain neutral. Yes, pH. A pH joke, everyone. All right, so this is, of course, an incredibly important topic, and perhaps one that, you know, for Ontario anyway, we talk a lot about soil pH. We correct for soil pH, but it's always been an important topic for the West, but perhaps not always as critical because our soils tend to be in the West a little bit closer to the neutral side. So, Jeff, maybe that's where we'll start, just to sort of paint that picture for us, and we'll get into some of the work that Miles is doing as well. But why has pH typically? What is it about the soil in the Canadian prairies that has made pH less, perhaps, of an issue as it is for, say, some other areas like Ontario?
Yeah, so I think it really goes back to when the glaciers laid down the parent material here on the prairies. There was a lot of lime or calcium carbonate that was inherently present in that parent material, Lyndsey. And so our soils formed on pretty basic parent material in, you know, an environment that really there's not a lot of weathering, not a lot of leaching. So the base cations like calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium tended to stick around. So as a consequence of that, our soils, we don't have to dig too deep before we can hit what's called the sea horizon, and they tend to be pretty rich in carbonates, a pH around 7.8 to 8.2 to upwards of 8.5. And our surface soils still have pretty good base cation fertility and cation exchange capacity, so a lot of those they're around that neutrality. As we move, towards Alberta from Saskatchewan, soils maybe tend to be a little bit more acidic there, just because of differences in the parent material, a little bit less carbonate. We go the other way into Manitoba, soils there generally tend to be maybe a little bit more on the higher pH side, more calcium carbonate there in the parent material. So we generally say our soils are kind of, neutral to calcareous, but we do have some pockets here in Western Canada, Saskatchewan, Alberta, of some soils that are acidic.
Mm-hmm. Now, Alan, let's look at why does that matter? Why does pH really matter? What is the actual sort of process of why a soil pH that is dipping lower can be problematic for agricultural soils? And if we want to go to your first slide, Alan, let us know, but it's up to you. But why is it such an important issue that growers know about the fields they're working on?
So pH is really one of the most important things we can measure, chemically at least, for the soil. And it's important because it affects virtually everything. It affects all the living organisms. It determines the balance of the different types of microbes we have. pH affects nutrient availability. pH affects root growth. And when we get too acidic, we can even impair root growth. And in fact, when we exceed the plant's tolerance of that acidity, and you could bring up that slide now, but as we exceed the tolerance of a plant's acidity, the plant can actually die, and we can get that's not mine, but
yeah.
So different plant species have different tolerances for pH. So when we talk about pH, what we're really referring to, and I've illustrated that in this slide. This is not my illustration, but I really like this because it tells us what we're talking about. When we measure soil pH, what we're measuring is the hydrogen ion concentration in the soil solution. So that, and what this illustration shows is the equilibrium between what's in the solution and what's on this cation exchange complex, and maybe even in the minerals or the organic material that's there. What we're measuring is the hydrogen ions in the solution, but they're coming off of the cation exchange complex, or in some cases moving to that exchange complex, and so they're in what we call equilibrium. And so this cation exchange complex and all the minerals and organic material, that's a big reserve of hydrogen ions that can be released into the solution as those hydrogen ions in solution are depleted. It's just like any other cation nutrient like calcium, magnesium, potassium. They all work the same way. But we're measuring the amount of hydrogen in that solution, and that governs so many of our chemical reactions and influences virtually everything that's happening in the soil chemically.
Mm-hmm. So, Miles, this is where, and you mentioned that, certainly looking at water dynamics or water movement in soil, when we think about clay content, sand content, when we think about the actual composition of soil. So what is the role in looking at this, especially when we think about, something like buffering? Because sometimes we talk about, and Jeff mentions some of the cations that we're talking about. When I think about, a soil's buffering capacity, what does that actually mean at a chemical level?
Sure, yeah. The buffering capacity really means the soil's ability to resist a change in pH. So as Alan pointed out on this slide here, what we measure in pH is the solution acidity. And the clay and the humus in this slide here, they buffer the solution acidity. So if we add acidity to the solution there where the circle is, some of that acidity will be absorbed under the clay and the humus. So we may not measure any change in solution acidity even though we've added some acidity, because it's kind of temporarily taken out of play. Over time, if we keep adding acid to the soil solution, we'll kind of overwhelm that buffering capacity, and that's when we measure a noticeable change in pH in the solution. So the buffering capacity kind of infers a kind of a lag in pH changes. Yeah.
And so there's, in my mind, there's sort of two parts to that. There's what we add to the soil then, Jeff, that can, as Miles points out, be acidic. But then there's also the content of the soil. So either we're not going to call it hummus, although we want to, or I want to anyway. It is not a delightful chickpea snack. It is part of soil. Or the clay content. We can't really change the clay content of our soil, but we can change the organic matter or impact the organic matter of our soils. So, Jeff, what is it that we can add to our soils that may change that pH to the downside? Or how does building organic matter perhaps add that buffer?
Well, I guess, thinking first about building organic matter also acts as a kind of reserve acidity that can buffer pH change. So if you're adding lime to bring the pH up, protons will come off of that humus surface and resist against the pH increase, but it will also go the other way, as was described, that it will also help buffer against a pH decrease. So I think when we build up organic matter in the soil, that generally we're building up the buffering capacity of that soil, and that's something that we can change. Whereas maybe the clay content, not so much. The kinds of things that will add acidity to the soil, we think about that. One of them related to organic matter is when organic matter decomposes, we get carbon dioxide produced, and it produces carbonic acid in the soil water. We also get organic acids produced that will release some protons. So we think about that as being an influencing factor in affecting the proton load in the soil. The other one is nitrogenous fertilizers, particularly ammonium-containing or producing fertilizers. When they convert in the soil in a process called nitrification, the ammonium gets converted to nitrate. We get 2 protons produced, ammonium ion. So in that nitrification process, then where ammonium converts to nitrate, we get acidity produced. And so over the long term, we do need to be aware of that, Lyndsey. And I guess when we look at nitrogen fertilizers, and sometimes the question arises, which of those nitrogen fertilizers per unit of nitrogen would be most acidifying? And that would probably be ammonium sulfate being used as a nitrogen and sulfur source because the protons that are released form a strong acid, sulfuric acid, with the sulfate anion. So, yeah. Also, plant roots will exude protons as well when they take up ammonium nitrogen. So when they take up ammonium to maintain the charge balance, they release protons. So that's some more protons that are going into the soil solution, into the soil water.
We are going to take a quick break, but experience the most efficient system for delivering sulfur and phosphate to meet your crop's needs with Smart Nutrition, MAP plus MST. We'll be back with more RealAg Radio and this special edition on soil pH right after this.
Get ready for tillage season with the high-speed disc from Brandt. Cut and size residue, create ideal seed beds, and level ruts faster than any other tillage machine. It's a better field finish and fewer passes, so you can stay on schedule, no matter what fall throws at you. And right now, you can get yours with a $12,000 rebate. There's never been a better time to bring your operation up to speed. Visit Brandt.ca for details.
Infuse some energy into your next corporate event, customer meeting, or conference with RealAg Radio, Canada's national agriculture radio show. Create a unique experience at your next event with host Sean Haney, broadcasting RealAg Radio live on SiriusXM, featuring exciting guests, captivating interviews, and the latest news from the agriculture community. Contact advertising at realagriculture.com or call 587-787-1795 to book your on location with RealAg Radio today.
There's a reason we call it the Corn School. Videos on everything from planter setup to weed control, field trial results, and the latest yield strategies. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com has the information and advice you need to help you succeed. Brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF. Corn School episodes are available at cornschool.com, from realagriculture.com, or as a podcast in your favorite podcast app. Check out the latest Corn School episode today.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. This segment is brought to you by the pre-emergent soil-active herbicides Valterra EZ and Fierce EZ from New Farm. Get ahead of hard-to-kill weeds. Spray this fall for up to 8 weeks of extended weed control next spring. Find out more about New Farm products at newfarm.ca. All right, and we hop back to our conversation on soil pH now. Walk us through this, and why can we see such a huge variation between such close areas?
So this is an example from northern Montana, and this is something we've been observing across the northern plains of the U.S. for, the last decade or so, but really it has become severe enough that it really merits some attention. And so there are several things to be learned from this. One, as the slide title indicates, it can be highly variable across a field, and this is because of soil variability in the buffering capacity from the parent materials from which that soil developed, variability in how plants have grown on that field before agriculture appeared on the scene even. But this is something that has occurred, this change in pH, and these are soils, as was described for Western Canada, that historically were neutral, slightly alkaline soils, and they have become acidified over a long period of use of ammonium-based nitrogen fertilizers. This is what's been attributed as the cause of this change in pH, and you can see at pH 3.8 we have almost no plant growth and certainly no productivity out of those areas. And in a picture on the right you can see those bare spots in the field. So there are half a dozen or so counties in northern Montana where this is become a severe problem, where as much as 40% of the acreage is reaching a pH that is almost not productive. this is a challenge that we have over time using ammonium-based fertilizers that we need to recognize. And in this area, for example, they need to start doing something to correct this pH. Now, in this case, the subsoils are still largely neutral to slightly calcareous, but this acidification is occurring at the surface where roots are growing. Roots are exuding acids. They're taking up that ammonium. The ammonium is nitrifying to nitrate, releasing all those hydrogen ions. And so over a long period of time, it's been a gradual change. And initially, you may not notice a difference until you reach a point where a colleague I used to associate with at Oregon State University called it falling off the cliff. You reach a pH that you've now exceeded the buffering capacity of the soil, and you've neutralized all of that reserve acidity, and now it crashes because you don't have that buffering capacity. All of the things that have happened over the years, decades, has overwhelmed that buffering capacity, I think is the word that Miles used. And so now it's become a management problem. And again, it can be highly variable across the landscape based on the types of parent materials and landscape positions and how water moves or accumulates across that landscape. Lots of factors why it's variable, but soil, basic soil properties determine that.
Now, Mark's got a really great question, and Mark, we are going to get to it. But Miles, I wanted to ask you, in looking at this, because this is, of course, this is an example we could see certainly on the prairies in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Certainly, it's all part of the same geographic region. Does tillage or the move to reduce tillage or even zero till, has that made this problem potentially worse because of potentially the stratification of nutrients or nitrogen being placed in the same layer, or how does tillage impact this at all?
Yeah, I guess in a couple ways. So I guess the first way is the legacy of tillage from basically the 40s until the 80s, where there was 3 or 4 tillage operations a year in these variable landscapes, moved a lot of soil around. So it moved a lot of topsoil from the knolls down into the depressions. So the knolls are depleted in organic matter. They've depleted that buffering capacity. And depending on the parent material, so in some cases, like what Jeff said, in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, a lot of that subsoil has a lot of carbonates. So you've probably in fields like that, you have high pH on the knolls and low pH in the lower slopes and in the depressions. Around Camrose in Alberta, where we're doing some of our work, the soils are solonetzic and they have subsoil acidity. So in some of the fields that we're working in, we see the knolls are more acidic than the lower slopes or the depressions, because there's more organic matter in the depressions and they tend to be more neutral, whereas a lot of the acidity is on the knolls on the top of the hills. So it depends a lot on kind of the history of the management and the parent material that you're dealing with. And then for no-till, there have been, and we're looking into this too, but there's some examples from Western Canada, from the Western United States, where long-term no-till has been associated with, we're probably well aware of the nutrient stratification, but because if you're applying fertilizer in a band at the same depth year after year, you may get pH stratification as well. So you may kind of get a narrow band of soil, at the depth of where the fertilizer is placed, 3 inches or so, that becomes quite acidic. And if you take a 0 to 15 centimeter or a 6-inch sample, some of the acidity in that narrow band may kind of be masked by the other depths that get captured in that sample. So it's not always obvious.
Mm-hmm. So that actually ties in with, and fantastic comments coming through about, actually mapping a pH across a field. So soil optics or using swamp maps, these sorts of technologies that are coming on board. And so some are sharing just how variable a field can be, and thinking about how we can manage for pH with liming or other issues, or other options. Does it become, a slam dunk for variable rate in this way? Calling all Montana, Dakotas, and northern Minnesota growers. The new seed omega-3 canola production system can help you unlock a guaranteed path to market with attractive premium opportunities, first-in-class agronomy support, and free on-farm pickup after harvest. Visit omega3, that's the number 3, canola.com. All right, we're going to take a quick break and be back with more of RealAg Radio right after this.
Calling all Montana, Dakotas, and northern Minnesota growers. Are you looking for a profitable addition to your farm that can deliver value beyond yield? The new seed omega-3 canola production system can help you unlock a guaranteed path to market with attractive premium opportunities and an active God clause. Contracts include first-in-class agronomy support and free on-farm pickup after harvest. Contracts are available now. Commit early to maximize your opportunity. To learn more, visit omega3canola.com.
What were the issues in your fields this year? Did you do a soil sample? What is your soil sample telling you about some of the nutrient issues that you might be having going into next year? What herbicides did you use? What residues you might be concerned about? What weed issues did you have? What crop residues did you have? How well do you know your fields?
Get the answers to all the questions you have about your pulse crop at the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com. Welcome back to RealAg Radio. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and this segment is brought to you by Brandt Agriculture Products. The Brandt high-speed disc is made to manage residue, condition seedbeds, level ruts, and reclaim wetlands in the most challenging conditions. Lead the field with a lineup of versatile high-speed discs from Brandt and achieve better results with every pass. And receive up to a $12,000 rebate for a limited time. Visit brandt.ca for more. All right, we jump back to our conversation on what you can do about a changing soil pH now. Here in Ontario, and I heard this a couple years ago because I'm a transplant to Ontario. So I heard the phrase, spend your first dime on lime when it came to nutrient management. So Alan, I'll go to you on this one. Liming, the addition of lime is a common way, certainly here in Ontario, that producers address pH problems. It isn't necessarily as common in other areas, often because of cost, availability, etc., which we'll talk about as well. But Alan, talk me through sort of just how huge of an impact correcting pH can have on yield potential.
Well, because really all of the nutrients are affected in one way or another by soil pH. And so when the soil becomes too acid, phosphorus availability can decline. Phosphorus availability is at a maximum in that slightly acid range, about 6 to 7 pH is our maximum phosphorus availability. When pHs get down about 5.5 or lower, phosphorus starts to react with aluminum and it becomes less available. And on the other hand, we can have some nutrients like manganese particularly that can become toxic at those pHs, and then it starts to affect root growth. Aluminum becomes more soluble and starts to form these club roots that some may have seen. And so all of these things affect our nutrient management. So by adjusting that pH to a proper range, and typically we're targeting something around 6 to 6.5 is considered a good target for most crops. And so adjusting the pH to that range by liming can help optimize nutrient availability, optimize root growth, and we do want to. I do want to say make mention that we might want to have a different pH target for different crops. Our legumes, for example, we'd like a little bit higher pH because nitrogen fixation is particularly sensitive to acidity. If we become too acid, those rhizobia don't work very well in the nodules. So if we're growing alfalfa, for example, or especially like peas and lentils, dry beans, those kinds of things, we might target a pH closer to 7 rather than 6. But wheat does very well at a pH of 6. And that helps us prevent the toxicities of things that become really soluble in very acid conditions, while also maintaining optimum phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen availability. And one other thing that we should mention is in very acid soils, we usually become depleted in calcium because calcium is part of that buffer system that helps keep the pH near neutral. And so as that becomes depleted and the soils become more acid, then we may have cases, and this isn't as common, but we may have cases where calcium becomes depleted and liming restores that calcium to a more proper level. So it affects all of our nutrients, and different nutrients in different ways, but they're all affected in one way or another.
So Mark's question, and Jeff, I'll go to you on this one first. Does pH affect nutrients from different sources differently? So, for example, is nitrogen, but if it comes from manure, is it different plant availability at the same pH versus a commercial product? How do we answer that?
Yes, I guess if you're thinking about manure itself has a buffering ability because it's got the organic matter. It's also typically got a lot of base cations like calcium. So that in itself will influence, for example, of the nitrogen in that manure. Even though there may be some acidity produced during decomposition of the manure, the conversion of the organic N to ammonium and the ammonium to nitrate, you do have that organic material there to help buffer that. And the same way with micronutrients. You know that we generally those organic materials that are produced during decomposition and contained in manures itself can help complex and keep those micronutrients in solution. So there's a lot of ways that these kinds of organic amendments can as a soil amendment and as a nutrient source themselves can help address some of those issues related to for example acidity that might be associated with just an ammonium form of nitrogen alone.
Right. Now at the same time, if you need to add a lot of nitrogen, manure alone won't do it necessarily, right?
That's right.
So we have to keep that in balance as well, is that.
Absolutely. We have to recognize that in many of those organic sources that you don't get it all available that first year. It takes time to get that nutrient out. Yeah. Right.
Absolutely. Okay. So there are different sources of lime, and Ray DeBanco has weighed in here. I had never heard of before, and we do actually have a clip from a Pulse School, which we may play in just a moment here, of beet lime. So, Miles, I'm going to go to you because this is an Alberta thing. Yes, we have it here in Ontario as far as sugar beet production. What the heck is beet lime? Do tell.
It's basically lime that's used in the processing of sugar beets to produce the sugar, I guess, from them, and it's reprecipitated. So it's essentially calcium carbonate. It's just been through a process, and it's been reprecipitated. And so it comes, and it can't be reused for whatever reason. So it comes out, it has some moisture. It's not completely dry. Probably has a little bit of organic matter from the sugar beet residues. But yeah, it's essentially lime. Yeah.
Yeah. But so it's my understanding that you can, as a producer, agronomist, whatever, you can source beet lime either for free, but you have to pay trucking. And that, depending on where you are, could make it very expensive if you need a lot of this or if you're not very close to where it's being processed. So that's a consideration.
Yeah, basically, a lot of the different products have different purities, I guess, that you have to account for, but they all kind of end up doing similar things. And the decision about which one to use often boils down to practical considerations and logistics and costs. Mm-hmm.
So, Alan, we have other options, right? So we do have several lime options. How do I decide which one? Is it really just about availability? Are they all created equal? How do I make the choice?
Yeah, great question, because that is an important part of choosing the source. There's another part of Ray's comment that we should address, and that is that, and one of these different forms of lime comes from a mineral we call dolomite. Well, that's a calcium magnesium carbonate. So in cases where magnesium is low in the soil, we might choose to use that dolomitic lime instead of buying a magnesium fertilizer. So if magnesium is low in the soil, that's a good choice. It behaves very similar to calcium carbonate, maybe slightly less soluble, but So coming back to your question, what do we look at with a liming source? Well, there are three main factors. One is, what is the chemistry? What's its neutralizing value? Calcium carbonate, calcium oxide, calcium hydroxide, magnesium oxide, any of these materials that have a base and one of these calcium or magnesium cations can function as a liming material. So the neutralizing value, and it's just based on their chemical formula. Calcium carbonate is 100 grams per mole, as it were, where calcium oxide weighs a bit less, and so it takes a lot less calcium oxide than it does calcium carbonate, but their neutralizing value is equal once you calculate that out. Now, the other factor is fineness. How fine are they? Finely ground limestone reacts much quicker. If it's coarsely ground, like gravel, we might spread limestone gravel on our roadways. Well, that's not going to be very effective. It'll probably have zero liming value in our lifetimes. So it needs to be ground fine enough to react with the soil. And then the third one is the purity. Are there other impurities in there, like the beet lime that was mentioned? There may be some impurities in that reduce its value. Now, beet lime is actually a pretty good liming material because it is finely ground. It's calcium carbonate. And while it may have a few impurities, it's usually a pretty economical material and very effective liming source. So these are some of the things to take into account. And there's a formula. You put all those three things together. We can look that up on many websites. But you put those three factors together, and it spits out a value called effective calcium carbonate equivalent. And so it just compares a specific material, its neutralizing value, its fineness, and its purity to pure finely ground calcium carbonate. And so you can get a relative estimate of its value, and then you can use that in your price shopping for some of the different sources.
That right there is worth this entire episode, everybody, because that is it might seem like common sense, but I think there are a lot of questions, and based on what's popping up in the chat as well, there are a lot of questions about how do I consider the source of what type of lime to actually use, because cost is obviously a big part of it, but so is effectiveness. And so obviously you need to be putting on enough. Yes, Alan, go ahead.
There is a question in the chat that I should address while we're talking about these materials. Several comments about gypsum.
Right.
Gypsum is not a liming material. It's a neutral salt. It doesn't really change the pH. Now, if we're in a very acid condition where aluminum is toxic and manganese is toxic, and we don't have access to a liming material, calcium can, to some degree, ameliorate those toxic effects of aluminum, but calcium sulfate doesn't change the pH, so it's not going to be considered a liming material.
It's almost like a buffering, but not a liming kind of solution. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, and the gypsum is an excellent, raising that as an amendment. Because oftentimes the question's raised about, we have in the prairies here in Saskatchewan some sodic soils, some saline sodic soils that are actually quite high in pH. And they're high in pH because that exchange complex has a high content of sodium. And we get a lot of hydroxyls. And, we can get pHs 8.5, even above. And the sodium causes lots of problems in the soil structure, tends to make the clays disperse. And so gypsum can be used as an amendment. The calcium will displace the sodium off of the exchange sites. And if you can get that sodium leached out of there, you can amend that soil then and have some improvement in structure and bring that pH down some. And so that's a couple of positive factors, things that are going on there that would help improve the productivity of that soil.
Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know who wants to take this one. Or go ahead, Miles. Yeah, we've got a few other things to go on this one. So this is great.
Yeah, sure. I'll just jump in and say kind of the non-standard liming materials like wood ash and cement kiln dust. Those generally are quite a bit less effective than calcium carbonate or a limestone source. And they can be variable too. So if you're looking at some of those sources, if they're available, they're still viable sources, but they should be tested to see what their neutralizing capacity is before you determine what rate you want to apply.
Just a fascinating discussion. Okay, we're going to pause, take a break. Remember to protect your anhydrous ammonia and bottom line, even if temperatures hit 15 degrees or below. That's not too late to apply agronomically effective, non-corrosive Centuro nitrogen stabilizer. Learn more at centuro.ca. Let's take a break, and I'll be back with more of RealAg Radio right after this.
Advanced canola trait technology is here. And it's soon to be the talk of the town. Optimum Glide delivers excellent yield potential and agronomic trait performance. Improved crop safety. Enhanced weed control. And a wider window of application. You're going to want to see this. Learn more at OptimumGlide.ca.
Peter Johnson at WheatPete, RealAgriculture.com. I'm the host of The Word, and I love doing The Word. I love the questions. I love the challenges. I love having to apply agronomics to all over the globe and areas outside of my normal jurisdiction. Also, I love the feedback the most, where growers challenge me, tell me about their plot results, help me to learn. The Word, absolutely the best part of my day.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. We have reached our last segment of the day, and we will continue on with our conversation on soil pH right after. Considering nitrogen fertilizer is your number one farm expense, farmers are working together through Genesis Fertilizers to solve the problem of high prices and security of supply by planning a state-of-the-art nitrogen plant. Security and earnings through ownership is the solution. Visit Genesis today at genesisfertilizers.com to learn more. Right, we hop back into our conversation, answering your questions on soil pH right now. Kevin's got a great question. Is there a maximum amount of lime that can be applied per year? And this is how you know he's a dairy farmer in BC. Because I would be, what's the least amount I can apply? Because I'm a sheep farmer in Ontario. So that's the difference, everybody. Just kidding, Kevin. Love you, buddy. Okay. So, but is there, beyond the cost, is there a danger in doing too much? And to add to that, are we better off doing smaller applications over time, or are we one and done? Who wants to take that one first, or at all? Anybody? Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
I'll make a few comments to that. And okay. I don't know if I could give an exact number as to what's too much. But yes, we can overdo it. Now, let's take these examples from Montana where the pH is 3.1 or 3.8, where you're looking to make a really big change. In that case, you're better to do what you were suggesting and apply smaller amounts more frequently rather than try to apply a very large application, because that the recommended rate of lime for something like that might be 6 or 8 tons per acre at a single time. And so, again, what you may do in the short term is overload that buffering capacity and raise the pH to something that affects nutrients the other direction and raises it too fast. And so this is a function of buffering capacity and the material you're adding. But usually we can look at these buffer pH tests. They will give us a recommendation. And oftentimes it's a matter of economics. I can't afford to go out and apply 6 or 8 tons per acre in 1 year. So I may need to amortize that cost over a period of time and apply smaller amounts every couple of years. Now, typically in soils that are limed regularly, soils that are naturally more acid. So we look at the Corn Belt of the U.S., where growers are applying lime commonly. And they will make those applications, say, every 3 or 4 years to maintain that pH. If we get into a situation where it's gone too far and we haven't been paying attention because maybe we weren't grid sampling, we didn't notice that we were close, and now we need some pretty severe corrective action, that's when it's better to apply smaller amounts more regularly. But within the range of, say, 2 to 3 tons per acre, that's probably not going to be a problem. I think those kind of rates are frequently applied in areas that need liming regularly. So, but if I'm putting out 8 or 10 nuts, I can't afford that anyway, so I should spread that out.
Neither can I, Alan. I'll be honest. So there you go. Okay, now, so Ray wants to know, so Jeff, maybe I'll go to you first on this one. How does the panel view powdery limestone as opposed to pelleted limestone here, as opposed to its use in Brazil? So Jeff, I've only ever seen the powdery stuff. Apparently it comes in pellets. How should I approach that?
Yeah, I would say, I think with a finely ground, powdery, high surface area, higher rate of dissolution is going to be beneficial in efficacy, and especially increasing the speed at which that acidity is addressed through the application. I really don't have any personal experience with either form itself or what goes on in what they're doing in Brazil. But generally, I think the feeling is fine ground is going to be more efficacious than coarse ground. But perhaps Miles or Alan have some experience with that as well.
So I would say, generally speaking, I think the pelletized lime products are effective insofar as what they are. They take finely ground lime and compress it and bind it into a pellet. And yes, the application is easier. It's easier to handle. It's more convenient. Could even be blended with fertilizer in many cases. But the challenge with those materials is cost. When we're needing to lime the soil and raise pH, we're usually needing tons per acre. And those materials are not going to be competitive for those kinds of rates. So maybe you can do a great job in a band with your phosphate in an acid soil and maybe do some good with that. But it's too expensive to apply the kinds of rates that are needed to really adjust the pH, usually. That's kind of my assessment of those pelletized sources. I don't think the products themselves are inherently poor lime sources. They tend to be effective, depending on what they're actually made of, the base composition. But again, they're generally too expensive to apply the kinds of rates you really need to adjust the pH.
Mm-hmm. So this, of course, makes me think of like the difference between elemental sulfur in a big pellet versus a smaller one in surface area. Just that's how my mind works. And that actually works into Jason Vogt's question, who's in southern Manitoba, who says there are so many that feel or are being told they can reduce pH via sulfur, in particular elemental sulfur. Curious how the panel feels about this or how to bust this myth. Miles, do you have any experience with this sulfur question in pH?
Yeah, we at the University of Alberta, we have a long-term research site called the Breton Plots, which has in the gray soil zone that was developed under the forest vegetation, and these soils are naturally sulfur deficient. And so we've been applying elemental sulfur as our sulfur source in some of the treatments there since since 1980. And so yes, it does in the treatments that have received elemental sulfur, the pH is lower right now. The pH decreases faster than other treatments that don't receive elemental sulfur or that receive manure. And so, yeah, if you look at the chemistry, oxidation of elemental sulfur in the soil yields acidity. And so if you have a situation with high pH, elemental sulfur would be an amendment you could use to reduce the pH. But you have to kind of take the same things into consideration as if you're applying lime to increase pH. You got to consider the soil's buffering capacity. You got to consider your target pH and all those things. So, but yeah, it is a viable option.
Ray wants to know if I was even born in 1980, and how will have you know, Ray, that I was. So I was already born. But I'm not telling you any more than that. You can guess the rest. So there you go. Okay, Producer Jay, could you go to, actually, while we're talking about it, Miles' slide that talks about different yields in these same plots, because I wanted to touch on this before we go to our last read of the night. Okay, hang on. Balf, Alberta, am I saying that right? Are you making up names?
Because
that's...
Yeah. Yeah.
Both.
But okay. Before I talk a little more, I think Jeff had his hand up. Jeff,
okay.
did you want to jump
Go
in
ahead.
on the sulfur?
I'm just going to make a comment about the elemental S, because
yes.
of course, in order to get the acidity, the elemental S has to actually undergo the oxidation, and that's very much a function of the particle size. And if you have micron-sized elemental sulfur, it'll oxidize fast, but if you've got great big chunks of it, it'll be very slow. So the efficacy of elemental sulfur in lowering pH is going to really depend on all the factors that affect its oxidation, like the particle size of the product, as well as the environmental conditions that affect the activity of the microbes that carry out the oxidation. So it's kind of a hard one to predict what you're going to see in the end, and it takes time.
Right. Okay, so just as a snapshot in sort of building off that, Miles, these are some of the findings from these plots on the long-term effects in wheat. So just walk me through this. That's a pretty 50 to 36 bushels is a pretty significant difference.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because this is actually where the pH and the acidity has an effect on another crop in the rotation, which is what's affecting the wheat. But this is this slide here, the lime and the no lime on the left and the right. These are from our long-term treatment that receives N, P, K, and S fertilizer. The N is as urea, P is triple superphosphate, potassium is potash, and S is elemental sulfur. And the rates, it's in a 5-year rotation. So there's 3 years of cereals and then 2 years of alfalfa brome forage. And so we can see here that the lime compared to the no lime, there's a big difference in the nitrogen uptake. And the way I interpret this is it's really about the nitrogen balance of the rotation. The plots with no lime, the alfalfa doesn't fix a lot of nitrogen because the pH is below 5.5 now. So we can see in the field on those plots when the forages are in the forage phase, there's hardly any alfalfa at all. It's all clover. So alfalfa is seeded. It doesn't establish. It doesn't fix nitrogen. So in the limed half, it's getting the benefit of the alfalfa, the nitrogen fixation from the alfalfa, and the plot that isn't limed, it's not getting that benefit, and the nitrogen fertilizer rates are the same. So what we're seeing here is kind of a rotation effect.
Janet's got a great point here. Alan, I'll go to you maybe on this one. Is too much lime at once going to cause an issue to the soil micropopulation that I have to worry about?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes. I can't say that I've seen specific studies on over-liming and its effect on the microbiome, but if we think about each of these different types of organisms in the soil microbiome, and we have different classes, and they respond differently to pH. For example, higher pH tends to favor bacteria and actinomycetes. The fungi prefer the more acid conditions. So under a forest environment, we have more acid soils. We find a lot more fungi than, say, in the grasslands where we have higher pH, and the bacteria and actinomycetes are very dominant at those higher pHs. This is why we get higher nitrification and denitrification rates at higher pH, because those are bacterial transformations, and so higher pH tends to favor those. While I don't know if there is specific harm from this reaction of calcium carbonate with hydrogen, we could certainly change the populations of these organisms and create a different balance. And so, like we said, this pH 6 to 6.5 is kind of an optimum we target. Well, if we look at this slide, at that pH, they're roughly in balance, and we have good numbers of all. But if we overlime, then the fungi are less prominent at those high pH.
And so ends today's show here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. I have been your host, Lyndsey Smith, and this has been an absolute hoot. Everyone have a wonderful week. I'll be back for the Issues panel on Friday. Cheers, everybody.